So what I'm going to do is briefly talk about the history of conservation environmental movements. I'm going to go through this relatively rapidly. So I'm going to do this over a timeline that I've broken into several phases, and in those phases I populate that with prominent disasters, which are things that catalyze actions. I also use prominent people and major concepts that came out during those periods. I'm going to do it in two major sections: the conservation movement, the 100 years between 1850 and 1950, and then the environmental movement from 1950 to present, broken into smaller sections: emergence, institutionalization, globalization, and then the current and future. So the conservation movement, about 100 years of a pastoral approach, sometimes religious. This is looking after God's creation. This is when we started building park systems. The field of ecology was developed. The wild places on Earth were discovered. We sent explorers to the poles, to the jungles, to the mountains, to the oceans. We had some large-scale species extinctions, like the bison or the passenger pigeon or the stellar sea cow. Some large-scale environmental degradation was evident, like the soil erosion associated with the Dust Bowl, the deforestation of North America, polluted rivers, and we populated large population expansions into very remote areas of the globe. So one of the early thinkers in this was Henry David Thoreau, and he published on Walden Pond, which was a sort of a treatise on living in this very small cabin in western Massachusetts. And one of the terms he coined was, "In wilderness is the preservation of the world." He also published some other books, very much. We don't usually associate him as a nature author, but in fact he often served in that role. We also formed a bunch of U.S. conservation organizations. The first national park under President Grant was created, Yellowstone, preceding the National Park Service, which was created, as you can see, much later, in 1916 by Teddy Roosevelt. James Audubon created the Audubon Society, which is the first big NGO for conservation in 1886. Not far later, not too distant, was created the Sierra Club by John Muir, and this is actually a photo of John Muir and Teddy Roosevelt at Yosemite. We created marine labs during this period. The first marine lab in the world was created in Italy, near Naples, the Station Zoologica by Anton Dorn. The first marine lab was created in Woods Hole, Marine Biological Lab, in 1888. The zoological station was 1879. And then the first state marine lab, and now all the states have them, was Chesapeake Biological Lab in 1925. And the key people that started the U.S. labs were Louis Agassiz in the famous quote he's got, "Study nature, not books," which he put over the school, which is still at the Marine Biological Lab, and Reginald Truitt, who started CBL. The field of ecology was developed during this period. Ernst Haeckel coined the term ecology, said it meant the body of knowledge concerning the economy of nature. Victor Schulford, who was a University of Chicago professor that studied the beach, the succession of beech dune into the beech maple forest, started the Ecological Society of America in 1916, and then Ray Lindemann, who didn't live a long life but had impacted the world by creating the term ecosystem, talking about the system of physical, chemical, biological processes, which is the biotic and abiotic environment. So 1940, that was in 1942. So during that period, we had a prominent ocean explorer, William Beebe, who wrote very popular magazine and articles that were serialized, like Saturday Night Evening Post, and then a series of books. He invented the bathysphere, the little round steel container that lowered him and one other person down 3,000 feet off of Bermuda, and he radioed back his observations. His first one really chronicled deep bioluminescence. There was a prominent disaster in this period, the 1930s Dust Bowl. Steinbeck wrote The Grapes of Wrath, talking about the forced migration. It led to changes in soil conservation practices and stimulated reservoir construction. legacies to this that continue to this day. And then after that conservation period, we started with the emergence of environmental movement. It wasn't really quite there until 1970, but in from the 50s and 60s is when awareness became raised. There was a struggle for recognition that environmental problems were significant, lots of disasters, which really galvanized people, and a growing recognition that toxic chemicals and excess nutrients were harmful. A couple of really important leaders in this were Aldo Leopold and Rachel Carson. Leopold was in Wisconsin and wrote about the Sand County Almanac, which was just a sort of a chronicle of the land over a period of a year. And he said, "There's some who can live without wild things and some who cannot. These essays are the delights and dilemmas of one who cannot." And then Rachel, she was the author of a series of very popular books, including Silent Spring. And Silent Spring was so important because first the title came about, a spring without voices, because the birds were pretty much diminished because of DDT. And so she went after DDT, vilified at the time, but vindicated in the end. And we're, of course, very proud that the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science Research Vessel is named after her, Maryland, where she did most of her work in Maryland. She's from Pennsylvania, but the Rachel Carson is in her honor. John Steinbeck and Ed Ricketts wrote books that really celebrated the lives of marine biologists. Ricketts was the marine biologist. Steinbeck was the author, and he befriended Ricketts, and they wrote a series of, Steinbeck wrote most of these books. I guess he co-authored Sea of Cortez with Ricketts, and Between Pacific Tides was Ricketts and Jack Calvin. And this was all based in Monterey, California. Monterey, now where there's a big aquarium, and but at the time it was a seaport for the anchovy fishery. And that was the canneries for that. Prominent environmental disasters occurred in this period. The London smog event in 1952, 5 days of smog from local coal burning stoves and a thermal inversion in the wintertime led to 4,000 deaths and a lot of sickness. The first major oil spill, the Torrey Canyon, was spilled oil onto the coast of England and France, and thousands of birds and seals and etc. So, and well chronicled by the press. And then the famous Cuyahoga River fire in Cleveland, Ohio, where the river caught on fire. Basically, it was oil slick, and it was well covered by Time and magazine, and really the juxtaposition of a river on fire really captured the public's attention. Another thing that's really important, that it wasn't really a direct environmental thing, but it was this picture of the Earth that the astronauts took from the Apollo missions. And I thought Cousteau did a good job of saying that the Apollo astronauts established for humanity a lunar observation post, which gave us a new vision of the universe, the most telling photograph not of the rocky lunar landscapes, but rather the photograph of planet Earth, and this idea of spaceship Earth. We're all dependent on this tiny little blue bubble out in the universe. So that sort of was that was the things the enabling conditions that really galvanized the beginning of the environmental movement from 1970 to 1990. This is where it became a very activist approach with legal solutions. A bunch of environmental agencies were created nationally and internationally. Important environmental legislation was passed, like the Clean Air and Clean Water Act. Dire predictions about the future were coming out by people like Paul Ehrlich and the Club of Rome. Prominent environmental disasters led to legislative responses, and the recognition of global environmental issues for the first time came about, ozone and some early indications of climate change. So 1970, though, was a big year for the environment. It was the beginning of Earth Day. Senator Gaylord Nelson created this, and thousands of people marched all over the country, sort of like we've seen recently, but the issue there was the environment. So that was a big public expression. The EPA was created in 1970, and the first director, William Ruckelshaus, who was the director and this was created with President Nixon, and then Saturday Night Massacre, and his boss was fired for political reasons, and then he was appointed Attorney General, and he was fired. Or he resigned. Russell Train, who recently passed away here from the Eastern Shore here, was the second EPA administrator. Also, was the year of the Clean Air Act, which put caps on the amount of emissions, and so these were really important long-term legacies created in 1970. The popularist of the time was replacing William Beebe with the new technology of film and video was Jacques Cousteau, and he co-invented this scuba regulator pictured here, self-contained underwater breathing apparatus. He made popular books, films, and TV series, highlighted the effects of overfishing, and really was the first to develop ocean conservation ethic. He also, there's a picture of an underwater habitat that he had people living in the Red Sea for several weeks. And so he was a real important popularizer. A bunch of disasters occurred in the 60s, the Lake Erie disaster of oxygen depletion and the, quote, dead zone for Lake Erie, which resulted in Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement and phosphorus reductions, eventually a phosphorus ban. And at the time, some dramatic improvements resulted from that. Some backsliding has been occurring since. Another big disaster was this this Love Canal, which was an old shipyard. And you can kind of see in the photograph where there are no houses. That was like the dry dock, and they filled it in with earth and then built houses on it. But all the toxic contaminants from the shipbuilding industry were still in the soil, and the kids were getting these high rates of cancer. And the mothers banded together and became activists and marched and made a big enough stink about it that they were forced to do remediation for that particular site. But what was really important was it created Superfund, that's the colloquial name, but it's actually called the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation Liability Act. And you can see from the map, Superfund sites are all over the country where legacy contaminants have occurred. And typically the companies are long gone, but somebody has to be there to clean it up, and EPA regulates that. Another big disaster was the meltdown of the nuclear power plant in Chernobyl in 1986, which also had ramifications in phasing out nuclear power in many countries because of the fear of this contamination. 4.5 million people were compensated for the impact that this plume from Chernobyl had. 200,000 people still live in contaminated locations. Another disaster was another oil spill, Exxon Valdez, 1989, coming out of the port of Valdez at the terminus of the Alaska pipeline. Huge cleanup effort. They steam cleaned, detergent, and did lots of beach remediation that led to the 1990 Oil Pollution Act, which puts liability and penalties for the oil companies. So Exxon had to pay most of the cleanup. One of the big ideas that came out in this period was by James Lovelock, the Gaia hypothesis, proposing that the planet functions as a single organism, as a giant superorganism, and his evidence is comparing the planets to the closer to the sun and just a little farther from the sun, Venus and Mars, and how their atmospheres don't have any oxygen, and they're in chemical equilibrium. We're not in chemical equilibrium, and that's because of the living things on the planet that regulate the climate, the atmosphere. And it's also where activism, or ecoterrorism, in some people's view, really became prominent. The Greenpeace was born there, Earth First, Sea Shepherd. It was about whaling. It was the monkey wrench gang that Edward Abbey wrote. It was about, monkey wrenching, putting a monkey wrench into construction sites, spiking trees so that they wouldn't the loggers couldn't use a chainsaw, etc. So that came into being. And then, starting in 1990, this globalization is when partnerships became more common and consensus solutions. International agreements like the IPCC for climate or the UN Conference on Environment and Development, the Rio Conference, so to speak, Kyoto Protocol, development of publicly discussed ecosystem concepts. The prominent explorer that sort of took over Jacques Cousteau's role is Bob Ballard. He developed undersea telemetry systems, sent robots down, found the Titanic, co-discovered the hydrothermal vents, lots of internet connectivity, and so he's used the modern technology, live streaming stuff from some of his expeditions back to schoolrooms. He has a great TED Talk I highly recommend. A couple concepts that came forth. Bill Reese came up with this ecological footprint concept, which is like the city on this diagram of a big foot. The city needs to obtain its water and food and other certain fiber for building materials, and that footprint that urban area requires is much larger than the urban area itself. So that's the concept of the footprint, and that's been expanded to be that we need on a planetary scale like 4.5 planets for the population as it stands for the current levels of consumption. Another important concept, ecosystem services. We've talked about that already in lecture, but it's the processes by which the environment produces the resources we often take for granted. The real proponent for that is Bob Costanza. He used to be at CBL. He's now in Australia. Bob and co-authors wrote this Nature paper that really set the scene for the multi-trillion-dollar ecosystem services that we can attribute to nature, and lots of citations and a lot of follow-up. Another concept that was created in this era was the historical overfishing concept. Jeremy Jackson was the biggest proponent of this, and that was that going back to ancient, the first impact of humans on ecosystems was the fishing pressure, followed up typically by pollution and other issues. Don and I and others rebutted this slightly because they kind of cherry-picked a little and overstated, but still the rigor of, the relevance of the fact that overfishing has top-down trickle effects to the rest of the ecosystem. It's really important that they raised during this 2001 paper. Daniel Pauly came up with this fishing down marine food webs, which is removing the large piscivorous fish, fish-eating fish, and then when they're become less available, then moving to the smaller herbivorous fish, and then ultimately almost fishing down to the krill level because we remove those larger fish. So it's that transition and whole trophic structure changes because of this intense fishing pressure. Some prominent disasters occurred, like the tsunami in Indonesia in 2004, and one of the things that illustrated pretty clearly is that natural areas with mangroves as the natural beaches and mangroves were much more resilient than the areas that were used hardened structures. The man-made structures were completely devastated. So that was a good lesson. Other prominent disaster in the U.S., hurricanes Katrina and Rita hit Louisiana, New Orleans in particular in 2005, breaching the levees and causing this diaspora of people from Louisiana to the rest of the country, and just long-term impact on the population structure in that area. And they're still building levees and reconstructing some of those areas. Prominent disaster included Deepwater Horizon oil spill. We're going to talk much more about this later on as a case study. That's a photo of Don and the Oil Spill Commission. But this was a huge oil spill that dwarfed Exxon Valdez, which had dwarfed Torrey Canyon, and these are issues associated with too much, going real deep and not having the proper safety structures in place and protocols. And like I said, we'll talk more about that. So briefly, the current and future state of the environmental movement, trying to create resilience, is that there's a lot more emphasis on creating social economic solutions, increased role of private foundations and NGOs. Government's sort of stretched, it's already been stretched out. There's an impetus to address major global challenges, large-scale management experiments, because informed society, new problems are clearly going to emerge, and societal paradigm shifts will be affected. Climate disaster, we've already had a really good-sized one in Superstorm Sandy in 2012 in the New York City area, causing inundation, flooding, and lots of displaced, a lot of infrastructure impact, and sort of a wake-up call because it was so well covered and so prominent in New York City. So future challenge of population growth, and you can see the areas of the world where population is growing the fastest: Africa, South America, Indonesia, and Southeast Asia in general. And then the areas that have slowed, like the Western world, Australia, Europe, North America, and China has slowed as well. But also the increase in the affluence, which includes energy consumption, more protein consumption, more goods that people desire. Everybody wants a cell phone, smartphone, etc. So we have this double whammy of increased number of people, but the people requiring more resources from extracted from the earth. Increasing global CO2 and the other associated greenhouse gases that have been occurring is a global challenge. This is the famous Keeling curve by Charles Keeling and his son Ralph from the observatory on the top of Mauna Loa in Hawaii, the Big Island of Hawaii. And that's led to climate change, and I submit that climate change is the major global environmental challenge of our generation. The latest IPCC report is becoming more and more strident about the irreversible effects, and we're seeing sea ice diminishing and changing, all kinds of nonlinear effects occurring across the planet. So that's a real quick overview of the conservation and environmental movements that have got us to this point today.